I mean, obviously, speaking on it and being on the front, do you have any aspirations of being a political figure?
I like pussy and liquor too much.
They say behind every laugh, there's a secret. And behind the kings of comedy, that secret might be darker than anyone ever imagined. The internet's on fire right now after DL Hughley made a jaw-dropping claim about Steve Harvey, saying he secretly wanted...
But one of the interesting things, and I think about this all the time, is from the time Bernie passed till now, certainly I think society has changed, the way they digest entertainment has changed. So I think it would have been difficult. I think a lot of people would have had a hard time with some of the things that Bernie said and attended to things in his act. So
Bernie McGone. Yeah, gone. The same Bernie Mac whose raw, no-filter comedy lit up arenas and made millions howl with laughter. But if you believe DL, behind those smiles and suits was something far from brotherhood. Something built on jealousy, ego, and quiet resentment. This isn't just gossip. It's the kind of revelation that shakes legacies. Because if what DL's
a king of comedy.
After Bernie left, them same three guys I'm telling you about, the kings, right? Because DL is the greatest. There's no DL slander gets tolerated. They came to me. I was supposed to be the fourth king. I got the offer,
Then what happened?
but I turned it down.
Why?
Because you shit on Bernie, and I know the truth. You think I'm gonna let you shit on Bernie and then come get me? I'm the next king? Fuck you. Why? Because the whole time Bernie was here, you was acting like you was funnier than him. The reason you was supposed to go last is because it was your tour. Not it was gonna be called the Kings of Comedy, it was Steve's tour. These are the guys opening for him. That's why it was such a big deal. But you couldn't do it, because you can't beat the best. And until you humble yourself, you will forever be kinged by the king. You stop it. That man was funnier than all of y'all, and y'all thought y'all had one over on him. You thought he was black and ugly, and you were good looking, and he couldn't make it, because you did. And that ain't the way comedy works.
saying even might be true, it means one of comedy's greatest partnerships was built on betrayal. Imagine the Kings of Comedy tour, laughter echoing across packed arenas. But behind the curtains, cold silence, whispered deals, and tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Fans who grew up idolizing them are stunned, wondering what really went down when the lights dimmed and the microphones turned off. Did Steve Harvey truly want the spotlight all to himself? Or is DL just stirring old ghosts for attention? Tonight, we dive into the story everyone's suddenly talking about, the one that's got Hollywood holding its with one interview. A quiet studio, dim lights, and a conversation that no one expected to explode into controversy. Hughley leaned forward in his chair, his tone calm but his words sharp. He didn't raise his voice, but what he said cut deep enough to slice through decades of laughter and friendship. According to him, what the world saw on stage was never the full story. He spoke about Bernie Mac not as a fellow comedian, but as a brother who got caught in the wrong kind of storm. A storm built on pride, competition, and jealousy hiding behind smiles. The internet caught fire within hours. Social media timelines turned into battlegrounds. Fans were replaying old footage, zooming in on facial expressions, searching for hidden tension in every clip of the Kings of Comedy tour. People started asking questions no one dared ask before. If DL was telling the truth, what else had been hidden behind that laughter? What really went down when the cameras stopped rolling? There were stories floating for years about Steve and Bernie's strained friendship, but no one ever confirmed them. It was always brushed off as gossip, a small misunderstanding between men with big personalities. But this time, DL didn't sound like a man chasing headlines. He sounded like someone carrying a secret for too long. He said, "Bernie was the realest one of us all. He didn't play the game. That's why the game played him." That one sentence echoed across the internet. Journalists started digging up old interviews, moments where Bernie had hinted at feeling left out or pushed aside. In a 2003 magazine interview, Bernie had mentioned how he felt some people in the industry wanted his spot. At the time, fans thought he was just talking about Hollywood politics. Now, those same words hit differently. Forums filled up with fans comparing dates, quotes, and stories. They noticed that after the Kings of Comedy movie took off, Bernie and Steve stopped appearing together as much. Steve went on to do more TV, more hosting, more polished appearances, while Bernie stayed true to stand-up, the raw, unfiltered kind that made him who he was. People close to the tour started talking anonymously. One stagehand claimed there were nights when Bernie's set time was mysteriously shortened, forcing him to rap early while the crowd still wanted more. Another source said there were arguments backstage about who got to close the show. They said Bernie always believed the audience decided who should go last, and every night it was
to do it, and it kept my schedule. It just didn't work out, but I'm glad I didn't. I thought it got to be too messy, and I said it out loud. I think for a while, Club Shay Shay was like Wendy Williams with a weight set. Like, this dude. I mean, it was messy. The reason that those people went on Club Shay Shay in its first iteration before it became successful, it's because we saw what he did, and the reason I was gonna go on it is because we saw what Skip did to him. I said any number of things about the way Skip sunned him.
Is that when he said, "Put your glass back on"? Or
that was
like that?
So horrible to me that I think a lot of people were determined to help this black man be successful because of what had happened to him, and to kind of curate all that, have that place that they worked so hard for you to have, so you would have your own space, be just an amalgamation and curate all the bull that is happening in our community seemed insulting to me.
Right. And we're talking about, man, some of the same people that rallied around him to make sure.
Was obvious. Bernie brought the house down. But that didn't sit well with everyone. Steve, they claimed, preferred order, structure, professionalism, the kind that came from being the face of the group. The story kept growing. Old friends were asked to weigh in. Cedric the Entertainer stayed mostly quiet, saying only that brothers have disagreements, but the legacy will always be love. Still, the silence said more than words could. Fans started to piece together the puzzle themselves. One moment that went viral again was an old interview where Steve talked about Bernie getting the Ocean's 11 role. Back then, Bernie told GQ that he felt Steve tried to replace him in that film. It was dismissed as miscommunication at the time, but with DL's new claims, that moment suddenly felt heavy, like it was part of a bigger picture. And then came the debate. Was DL being honest? Or was he bringing back ghosts for attention? Because timing is everything. And some people thought it was strange he was speaking now, years later. But others said maybe he finally felt free to tell the truth. Online, fans were divided. One side called DL brave for protecting Bernie's legacy. The other accused him of disrespecting Steve, a man who had already paid his dues in Hollywood and built a reputation as a mentor to younger entertainers. Yet no matter what side you were on, one thing was clear. Everyone was watching. Commentators began revisiting footage from the Kings of Comedy movie, analyzing every glance and gesture between Steve and Bernie. One viral clip showed Bernie pacing before his set, nervous but focused, while Steve watched from the wings with a blank expression. Fans captioned it with lines like, "You can feel the tension here," and "This wasn't just a tour, it was a silent war." Internet detectives even started pulling up backstage photos, pointing out how Bernie often stood a step apart, smiling politely but rarely engaging deeply with the rest. But the most surprising part came when someone resurfaced a podcast interview DL had done years ago where he mentioned some people didn't want Bernie shining too bright. Back then, no one paid much attention. Now it was proof, at least in the eyes of fans, that this wasn't a new thought. It was something DL had been holding on to. He spoke about loyalty, about how fame can twist even the closest friendships. "We were supposed to be kings together," he said, "but sometimes even kings want the throne to themselves." The public response was wild. Comedy legends and younger comedians began choosing sides subtly. A few defended Steve, calling him a hardworking man who built his empire from nothing. Others said Bernie never got his full flowers while he was alive. On talk shows, radio hosts debated the story like it was a courtroom case. Fans who once laughed together over the King's routines now found themselves arguing online, saying things like, "You can't erase Bernie's greatness," or "Steve earned his spot fair and square." In Chicago, where Bernie came from, local radio stations replayed his old stand-up bits, reminding people why he was loved. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, where Steve's talk show had its base, fans defended him fiercely, saying he always honored Bernie's memory. But whispers kept spreading. A production assistant who worked on the tour years ago claimed that Bernie once said, "These ain't my brothers anymore. They just co-workers." Whether that was true or not, the quote took on a life of its own. It was shared thousands of times, layered over emotional music and fan-made videos. And through all this, DL didn't back down. In another interview, when asked if he regretted his words, he smiled faintly and said, "Truth don't need permission." That sentence alone reignited the fire. People began calling it the comedy civil war, a clash between legacy and loyalty. While Steve stayed silent publicly, insiders said he was aware of the story and wasn't happy. One source close to him told a gossip outlet that he felt hurt and betrayed, that a man he once called a friend would twist something so sacred. But DL kept saying the same thing. He wasn't attacking, he was clarifying. "People deserve to know who Bernie really was," he said, and that's what made the story so gripping. It wasn't just about fame. It was about friendship, ego, and how time can turn laughter into tension. In the eyes of fans, it was no longer just entertainment. It was a revelation. Something that made them question what they thought they knew about their idols. As more interviews resurfaced and more voices joined the conversation, the truth got harder to separate from the noise. But one thing no one could deny was that Dal Hughley's words had opened a door that could never be closed again. The tension didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder with every passing day. Social media became a storm of divided opinions, with hashtags trending across platforms. Fans were posting old clips side by side. Steve Harvey cracking a polished smile on one screen, Bernie Mac delivering his raw stand-up truth on the other. The contrast was undeniable. One represented Hollywood charm, the other embodied street authenticity, and in between them stood D.L. Hughley, the man who suddenly found himself both praised and criticized for breaking the silence. Interview clips started surfacing where Bernie had once joked about not being Hollywood enough to play the game. People began dissecting every quote like detectives chasing evidence. One fan wrote, "Bernie wasn't just funny, he was fearless. That's why they couldn't handle him." Another replied, "Steve always said he loved Bernie. Don't turn this into hate." The debates spiraled so far that even family members of the late comedian were being tagged in posts. Bernie's daughter, who had always stayed private, suddenly had people demanding answers in her comments. She didn't respond, but her silence became its own statement, fueling even more speculation. Behind the scenes, industry insiders whispered that Steve was furious about the rumors. One unnamed producer claimed that Steve felt blindsided. He had worked for years to build an image of respectability, and now his name was being tied to envy and betrayal. Some said he even called old friends to ask who was spreading the story, while others said he told his team not to feed the gossip. But whether he spoke or not, the damage was done. The words Steve Harvey and Bernie Mac were trending together for the first time in over a decade, and not because of a reunion. What made it worse was that DL's tone didn't change. He wasn't apologizing, and he wasn't backing away. During one podcast appearance, he doubled down, saying, "You can't rewrite history. People know who Bernie was. They know what he stood for." It was as if DL was defending not just a man, but a legacy he believed had been overshadowed by Hollywood politics. The host of the show asked him directly if he thought Steve intentionally pushed Bernie out, and Dahl paused before answering. "Let's just say," he said quietly, "not everyone was happy to see Bernie winning." Those few words sent shockwaves through entertainment news outlets. Talk shows picked it up. Gossip channels broke it down, and even mainstream media started covering the comedian feud. Fans began flooding Steve's old interviews with comments like, "Was this about Bernie?" Or, "You smiling too hard for someone that innocent." One outlet reported that Bernie's old friend and road manager claimed the comedian once confided, "Hollywood ain't about talent, it's about control." And for many, that felt like the heart of the whole drama. As the internet picked sides, People started revisiting the emotional history between all four kings. Cedric the Entertainer, who had always been the peacekeeper, finally spoke in a radio interview. His voice was careful, controlled. Man, people gotta stop trying to make something ugly out of something beautiful. We all had love for Bernie, he said, but fans weren't satisfied. They said it sounded rehearsed, too diplomatic, too safe. If there's nothing to hide, one tweet read, why not address DL's claims directly? The more everyone tried to calm it down, the more it flared up. One clip from an old press junket resurfaced where Bernie had joked that some people don't clap when you win. The crowd had laughed at the time. But now, in hindsight, it didn't sound like a joke. Internet sleuths slowed the footage, zoomed in on Steve's face, and claimed his smile faltered for just a second. Thousands of comments poured in, saying that second was all the proof they needed. Meanwhile, comedy clubs across the country were buzzing. Younger comedians were split, some defending Steve, calling him an icon who paved the way for black hosts and entertainers. Others standing by Bernie's legacy, saying he represented truth in a business built on performance. At one club in Atlanta, a local comic performed a set where he joked, if Bernie Mac was still here, Steve would still be closing radio shows. Not award nights, the crowd roared, half laughing, half nodding. Then a new twist came. An old assistant from the Kings of Comedy tour reached out to a gossip podcast. She claimed there were nights when the schedule mysteriously changed last minute, cutting Bernie's time or rearranging the lineup. It was weird, she said. Bernie was always the crowd favorite, but somehow he started going second instead of last. She didn't name names, but listeners didn't need her to. The implication was clear. The host of the show gasped dramatically and said, "So you're saying it wasn't Brotherhood? It was business." The clip went viral. Within a day, millions had viewed it. DL's name trended again, and for the first time, Steve's silence started to look strategic. He still hadn't made a statement, but every talk show, every gossip site, and every podcast was now discussing his story. Some experts even said the silence was smart, that the longer he waited, the more the public would lose interest. But others argued it made him look guilty, like he had something to hide. By now, fans weren't just talking about the past. They were questioning the present. They pointed out how often Steve talked about keeping faith and humility in his motivational speeches, saying it felt ironic in light of these new allegations. One viral comment read, "Funny how the man preaching about loyalty is accused of doing the opposite." Still, others defended him fiercely, writing, "You can't tear down a man who's been helping people for decades over hearsay." The debate had officially gone mainstream. Major networks began replaying clips of old interviews, inviting comedians, journalists, and cultural critics to share their takes. One commentator said, "It's not just about Steve and Bernie. This is about what happens when ego meets empire. Fame changes people." Another argued, Bernie was never interested in being polished, and that made him a threat in Hollywood. Maybe that's why these stories keep resurfacing. As the headlines piled up, DL Hughley's own tone became more reflective. He said in one segment, "You know what hurts? Seeing people twist it like I'm trying to bring another man down. I'm not. I'm trying to lift up a brother who never got his due." But not everyone believed him. Some claimed DL was only speaking up now because controversy brings attention. Others said he was finally unburdening his conscience after years of silence. Whatever the reason, his words had already changed the public's perception. Inside Hollywood circles, producers and agents were whispering that this might become one of the most uncomfortable stories of the year. One insider told a magazine, "This is what happens when legends get older. The truth starts to leak out." And through all the noise, one image began circulating widely. A black and white photo of Bernie McSmiling during his stand-up days, captioned with the words, "The Real King." That image said more than any headline ever could. It reminded people that beneath all the speculation and ego, there was a man whose only mission was to make people laugh. But laughter, as it turned out, wasn't enough to protect him from the politics of fame. And that's when the story took another turn. One that would drag in more names, more emotions, and leave everyone wondering if the laughter they once shared was built on cracks waiting to break. The noise had grown into chaos by the time Steve finally decided to speak. After weeks of silence, he appeared on a morning radio segment. his voice calm but heavy with frustration. He didn't name DL directly, but everyone knew what he was talking about. "It's sad," he said, "how people twist things when the man who's gone can't defend himself. I loved Bernie like a brother. We had disagreements, sure, but never hate." It sounded sincere, but some fans weren't convinced. They said he sounded defensive, rehearsed. Others said his emotion was real, that the man was just tired of carrying other people's narratives. As soon as that interview aired, DL responded in his own way, not through an argument, but through storytelling. He went live online, sitting in front of a plain background. No fancy setup, no filter. "I said what I said," he began. "Not because I want beef, but because people forget. Bernie was our brother, and I ain't gonna let his truth fade just because it makes somebody uncomfortable." That clip spread faster than anything else he'd said before. Fans called it raw, real, unapologetic. Some said it was unnecessary, that he was keeping old wounds open. But others said it was brave, the kind of honesty that Hollywood usually buries. Now, the feud wasn't just between two men. It had become a cultural debate. Morning shows, gossip outlets, and comedy podcasts were all weighing in. On one show, a guest said, "This isn't just about friendship. This is about legacy, about who history remembers as the real king." Another argued, "People love to romanticize Bernie because he passed young, but Steve worked his way up for decades. You can't hate a man for surviving the game." Yet in the background of every discussion, one feeling remained: sadness. Sadness that the kings of comedy, who once represented unity and black excellence, were now being talked about like rivals in a scandal. As the story deepened, someone released never-before-seen behind-the-scenes footage from the original Kings of Comedy tour. The grainy clip showed Bernie pacing backstage while Steve adjusted his suit in the mirror. They didn't speak. Cedric stood between them, cracking a quiet joke to ease the tension. The camera panned for a second, and in that brief moment, Bernie looked into the lens and smiled, tired but genuine. Fans replayed that clip thousands of times. To them, it was confirmation that something unspoken existed between those two men. "You can feel it," one comment read. The respect and the distance all at once. Then, like pouring fuel on the fire, a close friend of Bernie's widow appeared on a late-night podcast and shared something that reignited everything. She claimed Bernie once told his wife he didn't trust certain people on the tour anymore. "He said it broke his heart," she said softly, "because he thought they were brothers." Though she never mentioned Steve by name, the internet didn't need help connecting the dots. Fans flooded comment sections again, demanding truth, demanding clarity. Steve's team reportedly went into overdrive trying to calm the narrative. Insiders claimed publicists were calling networks to shift focus back to Steve's projects, like his TV show and Family Foundation. But by then, the story had taken a life of its own. Every news cycle, every gossip blogger, every commentary channel was feasting on the idea of betrayal between brothers. And the more everyone talked about it, the more details started resurfacing. An old journalist recalled how during the final leg of the tour, Steve skipped one group dinner, supposedly because he had business meetings. Some say Bernie didn't believe that. DL's interviews became emotional as the days passed. In one, he said, "You don't know how hard it is watching someone who gave their heart to the craft get erased like they never mattered." He looked down when he said it, like he was reliving something that haunted him. People noticed that even when he criticized the situation, he never once insulted Steve directly. Instead, he talked about the machine, a system that rewards control over authenticity. He said, Bernie wasn't fake. He couldn't be. That's why Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. That line hit deep, especially for those who saw Bernie as a symbol of truth in an industry obsessed with image. The tension between DL and Steve kept simmering. Some fans tried to de-escalate by reminding others how much the Kings of Comedy meant to culture. Others weren't so forgiving. They dug up old comments where Steve had once said, "There's no success without sacrifice." Fans twisted that into proof of guilt, saying it sounded like a confession wrapped in wisdom. A few even edited together side-by-side videos. One of Bernie performing his iconic closing act, and one of Steve giving motivational speeches about humility, with captions like "the king versus the politician." In comedy clubs, It became the most discussed topic. Comedians on stage started joking about it, using humor to process the tension. One said, "Hollywood friendship is like a group chat. All love until somebody gets more likes." The crowd laughed, but the pain behind the laughter was real. Everyone knew that no matter how many years passed, the shadow of what Dahl revealed would always hang over their legacy. Then came the twist no one expected. A tabloid claimed that a draft of a memoir Steve had once started writing years ago included a passage about a brotherhood that fell apart. The book was never released, but that line alone reignited speculation. Fans began posting, "So he did admit something happened." Whether the leak was real or fabricated didn't matter. The timing was too perfect. It kept the drama alive. Dahl tried to step away from the chaos. He told his followers, "I said my piece and that's all I'm gonna say." But the internet doesn't let things rest. Fans tagged him in every new theory, every new clip. Some accused him of creating a divide that didn't exist. Others thanked him for honoring Bernie's truth. Meanwhile, Steve focused on his shows, speaking more about faith, forgiveness, and moving on. But every time he posted something motivational, someone would reply, "Did Bernie forgive you?" What made the situation tragic was that both men, one alive, one gone, were now trapped in a narrative neither could fully control. One trying to defend his integrity, the other immortalized as a victim of a system that didn't appreciate him until he was gone. It wasn't just a feud anymore. It had become a reflection of something bigger, how fame can turn brothers into opponents, and how truth, once spoken, can't be taken back. As fans rewatched old interviews, one clip stood out. Years before Bernie passed, he was asked what kept him grounded. He smiled and said, "You gotta love people even when they don't clap for you." That line resurfaced everywhere. It became the unofficial theme of the entire saga. People wrote it under his photos, in tribute posts, in tweets defending his legacy. Even those who didn't know him personally felt like they did. By now, the narrative had reached a breaking point. DL's words had cracked open a vault that everyone was too afraid to touch before. Steve was no longer just a beloved host. He was a man forced to defend his character in a storm of assumptions. Fans weren't just choosing sides. They were rewriting history in real time, deciding who the real king was. And as the dust settled, it became clear that no matter what the truth was, the laughter that once united millions had turned into something else entirely. A mirror showing the cost of fame, loyalty, and pride. The noise finally started to slow down, but the damage was already done. Months had passed since D.L. Hughley's interview, yet the echoes of his words still lingered across social media feeds and news cycles. Fans had stopped arguing about whether it was true or not. Instead, they started asking what it meant. Because deep down, this wasn't just about two comedians. It was about what happens when brotherhood meets ambition, when love turns into silence, and when truth becomes more dangerous than lies. Steve Harvey kept his focus on his shows, his family, and his brand, speaking more about peace and purpose in his public appearances. He never mentioned Dahl by name again, but sometimes his choice of words during motivational speeches felt like veiled responses. One morning, on his radio show, he said, "You can't let people define your legacy for you. You gotta keep walking even when they throw stones." Listeners flooded the comments, saying it was clearly a response to the feud. Some praised him for taking the high road. Others accused him of hiding behind vague wisdom. Why not just admit what happened? One listener wrote, "Silence don't mean peace, it means guilt." On the other side, DL stayed quiet too, at least for a while. When he did speak, his tone was softer, more reflective. He told one interviewer, "People think this was about drama. It wasn't. It was about love, man. Love that didn't get the respect it deserved." Those words surprised many because they didn't sound angry. They sounded tired. Like a man who had said everything he could and knew nothing else would change the truth. Whatever it was, as time went on, new stories surfaced about Bernie Mac. Old friends, stage crew, and family members sharing memories of his humor, his temper, his loyalty. One comedian who toured with him back in the day said, "Bernie wasn't perfect, but he was honest. He loved hard, worked harder, and forgave slower than most." Fans latched onto that. They said that's what made Bernie different from the rest. He wasn't trying to be liked, he was trying to be real. And maybe that's what scared people the most. Then, out of nowhere, an old recording from Bernie's radio interview resurfaced. It wasn't scandalous. It was just him talking about the kings of comedy. He said, "We all had our roles, man. Steve was the businessman. Cedric was the cool one. Dahl was the thinker. And me? I was the hammer. I said what everyone was scared to say." The internet turned that into another wave of tributes. People commented things like, "Bernie knew his power," and "This right here explains the whole story." That old clip became proof, at least in the minds of fans, that Bernie always knew there was tension but didn't let it define him. A few months later, a charity event honoring Black comedy legends was announced. Organizers said they wanted to celebrate the legacy of the kings of comedy, to remind everyone of what they accomplished together. Steve was invited to host. Dale was invited to speak. And when the day came, fans held their breath wondering what would happen. Would they ignore each other? Would they acknowledge the tension? Or would they finally bring closure to something that had haunted comedy fans for years? The crowd was electric that night. Photos of Bernie Mac flashed across the screen while his voice echoed through the hall. When Steve took the stage, the applause was thunderous but heavy, filled with mixed emotions. He spoke about Bernie like a friend, laughing at memories, recalling their first shows and even admitting, "There were moments we didn't see eye to eye, but that's what brothers do." It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't denial either. It was something in between. Then, near the end of the night, Dahl was introduced. The crowd stood up. He walked to the podium, paused for a long moment, and looked up at Bernie's picture on the big screen. "We all miss you, man," he said quietly. "You taught us that laughter is truth, even when truth hurts." The room fell silent. Then he turned slightly toward Steve. Not directly, but enough that everyone noticed. "Time doesn't fix everything," he continued. "But it reminds us who we were before the noise." For the first time in months, both men stood in the same room, sharing the same stage, united, at least in appearance, by the memory of the man who made them legends. There was no handshake, no public reconciliation, no headline moment, but the air shifted. It felt like something finally settled, even if it wasn't peace. Fans who watched the clips later said it looked like closure, the quiet kind that doesn't need words. After that night, the story began to fade from headlines. The internet moved on to new controversies, new rumors. But every time someone mentioned Bernie Mac, the conversation found its way back to that era, to the kings, the laughter, the ego, the pain. In some ways, Dahl's revelation had brought Bernie's name back to life in a generation that barely knew his genius. Comedy clubs started dedicating nights to him again. Young comics quoted his lines. Fans rewatched his show and wrote things like, "They can argue all they want, but Bernie's still the people's king." As for Steve, he continued to dominate TV and radio, his career untouched by the storm. But behind the confidence, some say his tone changed. He spoke more about forgiveness, humility, and the price of success. Once, during an event, he said, "People talk about loyalty like it's easy. It ain't. When you get to the top, you look around and realize it's lonelier than you thought." The crowd clapped, but some listeners felt that line carried weight only he truly understood. Del, meanwhile, leaned further into introspective comedy, talking about legacy, truth, and brotherhood. He never named names again, but in one stand-up set he said, "The older I get, the more I realize that sometimes love ain't about being right. It's about not forgetting." The audience cheered, sensing the message beneath the joke. And somewhere in between those words, between the laughter and the silence, the truth remained, unconfirmed, unspoken, but alive. Fans still debate it to this day. Did Steve Harvey really want Bernie Mac gone? Or was it all just ego and misunderstanding magnified by time? Maybe the answer doesn't matter anymore. Maybe the real story is that fame can blur the line between love and competition, until even brothers can't tell which one they're fighting for years later. People still post old tour clips, still quote Bernie's jokes, still replay that legendary Kings of Comedy movie where four men ruled the stage like giants. The crowd's laughter in those recordings feels pure, untouched by the drama that would follow. And every time Bernie's voice hits the mic, every time he says, "I ain't scared of you," the audience cheers like it's brand new, because legends don't need defending. They defend themselves through the joy they left behind. And maybe, in the end, that's what Dahl was trying to remind everyone of. Not the feud, not the gossip, but the truth behind it all, that Bernie Mac's laughter was real, his legacy untouchable, and no amount of silence or jealousy could ever take that away. And that's where it all circles back. Not to gossip, but to legacy. Because no matter whose version of the story you believe, one truth still stands. Bernie Mac changed the game. He made people laugh when they needed it most, and his honesty cut deeper than any headline ever could. D.L. Hughley's words might have reopened old wounds, but they also reminded the world why Bernie's name still echoes across every comedy stage today. And Steve Harvey, for all his success and polish, remains a symbol of how fame can lift you high and isolate you just as quickly. The kings of comedy may never share a stage again, but their story continues to teach us something powerful about brotherhood, pride, and forgiveness. The real question now isn't who was right or wrong, it's what we can learn from it. When does ambition cross the line? How far would you go to protect your spotlight, even if it meant dimming someone else's? Those are the questions fans keep asking, and maybe that's why this story refuses to die. Because deep down, it's not just about celebrities. It's about every friendship that broke under pressure, every bond that cracked under success, and every truth that came too late. So what do you think really happened behind those smiles and suits? Was it just competition or something darker hiding in plain sight? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation isn't over yet. And if you want more stories like this, the ones Hollywood tries to bury, the ones that make you question everything you thought you knew, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe and turn on the notifications, because here, we bring you the stories the streets don't forget. This is Buzz and Drama, and we'll see you in the next one. And we'll see you in